we have a very, very special speaker here, an old friend of ours here at the Packet Hacking Village, at the Wall of Sheep. He is the Director of Security Research at Mobile Iron, our good old friend, Mike Rago.
You guys hear me okay? Cool. Cool, thanks for coming out, guys. Three things before we get started. First, wanted to thank Wall of Sheep for having us back, for sponsoring the Packet Village. Second, I want to dedicate this presentation in memory of somebody who is really important to me as a friend, and I know someone that helped run the Capture the Flag for many years, a fellow by the name of Mike Hamlin, also known as Hacker Joe, who unfortunately passed away at Christmas time due to a car accident that was not his fault at all. So in memory of Mike. And then third, I'm going to raffle off a copy of my data hiding book at the end of the presentation. If anybody wants to take a slip of paper with just their name, email address, whatever you feel comfortable sharing. And then I've got some free swag from Mobile Iron. So I don't really like to talk too much about myself, but authored a few books. We will be doing a presentation later on in the Wall of Sheep called Remaining Covert in an Overt World, which is related to a lot of research that Chet Hosmer and myself have done around steganography, data hiding, covert communications, things like that. So if you're into that stuff, definitely come by and check it out. Chet runs pythonforensics.org. And we've got a lot of interesting code and stuff that we've written. I'm going to show some hiding around smartwatches, actually. And then he's got some really interesting code that he's written, too. And then tomorrow, I'll also be presenting in the demo lab for 2 hours my smartwatch attack tool called SWATAC, which I'll highlight a little bit in this presentation as well. All right, so just two backdrop slides here before we really get into mobile data loss threats and countermeasures. When we work with a lot of folks, we find them trying to apply traditional security policies to mobile, and they don't always work. I mean, mobile is fundamentally different. I think most of us here understand those differences, but just to kind of, reiterate some of those. One is, a lot of these mobile operating systems are very different from your traditional PC, laptop servers, right? They have that kind of sandboxing type of approach in how they handle apps and data. So whereas in a traditional laptop or PC, you might have apps that have data, but that data is typically shared across all apps. A little bit different on a mobile device. But in a mobile device, you also have user capabilities and intents that do allow you to share data and take it, say, an email attachment, open it in a secondary app, edit it, and then thirdly, upload it to Dropbox and things like that. The other thing is, with the explosion of social media, cloud, mobile, and everything else, data lives everywhere. So that traditional firewall, I used to be a checkpoint trainer for many years, has really kind of vaporized, right? Data lives everywhere. And so in terms of mobile security and overall strategy, really important to kind of encompass that philosophy as well. And then thirdly, we've got this issue around BYOD and people wanting to bring their own devices into the organization. Very different for IT. IT traditionally has gone ahead and set up a laptop with all the relevant security controls, then gives it to the user. Now we have users that acquire the devices themselves, configure it themselves, and now want to connect it to corporate data. So in the research that we do, we kind of model out a lot of different threat vectors, and we find that they fall into one of four primary categories and kind of an emerging fifth category I'm going to talk about in a moment. First and foremost, a lot of organizations concerned about root and jailbreaking. From our perspective, we kind of refer to this more broadly as OS compromise. Lots of different variants in which a device can be compromised, and we'll talk about that in the next slide where we kind of break down the different variants and privilege escalations. Secondly, a lot of people are focused around mobile malware, and rightfully so, but there's also a lot of risks in legitimate apps that we use each and every day. Statistics show that the top 400 apps in the App Store and the top 400 apps in Google Play roughly the spread is 80% of those top 400 apps have some kind of risky behavior that could expose personally identifiable information, or PII. Thirdly, these devices update all the time. They're always connected. And every time a new version of the OS comes out, a new app comes out and introduces new attack vectors, threat vectors, and changes the landscape every single time. In addition, users can share data in a multitude of different ways, and that changes every time a new version comes out too. And then fourthly, we've got this issue we've had for many years. I used to run the research at Air Defense. This issue around man-in-the-middle attacks, right? You've got a lot of people here doing Wi-Fi and Bluetooth hacking. But we've got this issue around users that have these connected devices with enterprise data on them, or connecting remotely to enterprise data and connecting to open Wi-Fi, and even in secure Wi-Fi environments. Many of us are pretty familiar with Wi-Fi pineapples, Kali, Backtrack, other ways in which we can set up a fake AP or an evil twin to intercept or perform a full man-in-the-middle attack, and furthermore decrypt that traffic and terminate it. We released a smartwatch research paper this week where we broke down a number of smartwatches. So we took a look at the Apple Watch, we took a look at the Moto 360, the Samsung Gear 2 Neo, and then we also acquired a Chinese watch over eBay, just to kind of get a good cross-section of the smartwatches that are out there on the market and what type of risks they present to enterprise data. I'll highlight some of those results in a moment. The two trends that we see are, one, hackers are looking to the app. So in terms of comparing your traditional security policy and determining where to focus your efforts, one of the two main trends is that we see hackers are focusing on the app. Now that the apps are a lot more sandboxed, as well as their relevant data, we find more and more that the attackers, therefore, are trying to, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of the presentations over the last few years, trying to post malicious apps or apps that have some hidden behaviors within them. We'll break those down for you as well, so you can kind of be aware of those. And we'll also kind of reverse engineer in a couple slides some of those apps so you can see some of the hidden behaviors. But bottom line, the trends actually show that malware comprises less than 0.4%, while the actual larger risk of these risky behaviors in these legitimate apps we're using every day. The other thing is that commonly people want to determine, well, how do I, what's the best antivirus for mobile? And I say, hey, antivirus doesn't really work in mobile, And as a result, you may have seen kind of a reemergence of all these new technology companies that do app reputation or mobile threat prevention. They're looking for those threats. They can analyze an app when it's downloaded. They may correlate it based on what an enterprise mobility management or MDM may feed back to them, and they cross-correlate that data to determine, hey, do any risks exist in this app? If so, I'm going to flag it, report it back to the console, and quarantine the device. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as well. And then, in addition to all the detections around compromised devices in your organization, that's definitely important. But let me pause for a minute and ask the crowd, how many people here have jailbroken their device? Okay. And then let me ask a second question. When you jailbreak a device, I'm sure somebody in this crowd knows the answer, and Josh, I'm not going to let him answer because he used my other presentation. When you jailbreak a device in iOS, what's the default username and password? Okay. It's root with a password of Alpine. Yep, exactly. Thank you. So if you've jailbroken your device and you haven't changed the password from Alpine to something else, and you're on the same Wi-Fi network as somebody else, not even just an open clear text Wi-Fi network, but even an encrypted one, that unless you're running PSPF or client isolation, I can go ahead and scan that network, identify your iOS device, and log in via Secure Shell with a username of root and a password of Alpine. So when you jailbreak your device, keep in mind, you may not only make it vulnerable to the data that resides on it and to risks that may come down the pipe, but in addition, it's also vulnerable on the network. As we dig a little bit deeper, we're starting to see more and more threats that don't require a compromise of the actual device. So, FireEye had done some really good research around the mask attack, which also was around the same time as WireLurker. The anatomy of how this attack occurred, and they have a great video on their site, was that, hey, I'm going to go ahead and embed malware within a malicious update or an update to an app with hidden malware within it. But in order to do so, I'm going to need that enterprise certificate to sign that update so that when an unknowing user receives that update, they go ahead and update the app, and unbeknownst to them, they just infected the device with malware. Again, no jailbreak required. And then that allows data to be pilfered from the device, including the credentials, data, and other things. How this could occur is that if someone hacked your network and got the enterprise signing certificate, or if it was an inside job. So if you have internal developers that are creating mobile apps, do they all have access to that enterprise cert? And who's pushing out that update internally from your internal app store to all of your users? So really important to vet that out. That's why we partner with companies like FireEye, Veracode, who's also sponsoring the Wall of Sheep here, and many others to actually identify those threats and actually quarantine a device when they're identified. So if you've ever messed around with the Android SDK and a tool called APK Tool, you can actually take an APK and in a way kind of enumerate some of the capabilities of that app. You know, is it properly displaying all the capabilities when you go to download that app and install it? This allows you to go back and really determine that. And when you run this, as in this case, I kind of determined that there was a couple things that really weren't disclosed. First, it was able to write to external storage, okay, so it can modify, delete, do things on the SD card. The thing that concerned me the most was the internet access, which allows the app to open and close a network socket and actually do things like remote command and control, communicate outbound, exfiltrate data, things like that. And in addition, the other one that was kind of odd was the access network state, where an app can actually access information and actually monitor the VPN. So that was kind of interesting too. We'll talk later about Perapp VPN and some of the advantages to maybe doing that. That prompted me to do some dynamic analysis. So kind of broke out my Wireshark skills, fired up a network, and I really wanted to monitor what this app was doing. Now, the app had disclosed that it was actually encrypting the data in motion or in transit, but as you can see clearly here, when I went ahead to go ahead and change my password, it sent it clear text over the network. Okay? So again, certainly having that level of intelligence is key, but it's quite difficult if you're managing an enterprise and all those apps across all those mobile devices to have that level of visibility, right? So although it's good to go through this exercise for familiarity, it's just not scalable, right? So as a result is why you have some of those aforementioned companies that I talked about earlier. Also, I find a lot of organizations kind of look at mobile devices as, you know, are they jailbroken? Are they rooted? They kind of think of that as like a binary function. It either is or it isn't. And, you know, in a lot of the research that we do, it clearly is not really a binary function. We find that there's a lot of escalation of privileges, there are vulnerabilities in the devices, things like that that might be short of a formal root of the device that actually can lead to the same exposure of data on that device. When we take a look at jailbreak detection, not only are there a couple different ways in which you can jailbreak a device, but there are tools like XCON that can prohibit an enterprise mobility management from even detecting that that device is actually jailbroken. Okay, so there's some anti-detection tools out there as well. On the Android side, it's certainly more complex, but we find devices even out of the box. We just had a customer that had gotten a Nexus device, and out of the box it was already rooted. But in addition, there are custom ROMs. There's also a variety of backup software that actually kind of loosens up the capabilities on the device or loosens the security posture that, again, can lead to a lot of data exposure on the device. Furthermore, you've got users that, of course, may allow untrusted sources, enable the Android debug bridge and USB controls to allow sideloading of apps, but that can also allow sidejacking too. So having the ability to have that defense in depth to identify all of that stuff is certainly key. Something else that was kind of interesting was that when you take a look at enterprise mobility management, the fundamentals of it are, you know, you have a management console and then you have the app on the device, whatever the EMM product might be. Well, although that app may be identifying malicious behaviors, it's not always communicating back to the console. Usually that's on a scheduled frequency. The result is there's kind of a window of compromise there. If a device becomes compromised, that security app may identify it, but you may not be aware of it, and the console can't necessarily send down a quarantine to selectively wipe the enterprise data. So it's kind of a window of compromise there, and we kind of saw that. So one of the things we took a look at was the ability to do something locally on the device. So in terms of the things that we do, is the ability to have a living policy on the device to identify when a compromise has occurred and in real time selectively wipe that data. Also, having the ability to block that device's network access. All the devices are essentially going to be remotely connecting to the network. People are traditionally using VPN, but iOS natively supports per-app VPN. So now you can be more selective about what apps on the device can actually access the internal network. You can create a whitelist of only the validated apps that you validate the integrity of, and the rest of the apps are all blacklisted, including malware. So per-app VPN definitely gives you a really nice advantage there, too. So where did we identify overall, in conjunction with what we've done with AppTaughty, where a lot of the app risks emerged from? Well, that issue around developers making bad apps or downloading freely available libraries or SDKs and embedding them in the apps certainly is contributing to this problem. And so therefore, vetting those internal apps is certainly key. And are all the people internally really trusted? Maybe you want to have your secondary administrator actually do the validation of the apps by uploading them to one of those products that I mentioned that allow you to further validate that app before you push it out to the users. NIST also really calls out what PII is. It's a frequently asked question I get from a lot of folks. Well, when you say PII, what exactly do you mean? We use this as a reference in terms of GPS information, contact information, email addresses, physical hardware information, things like that. So you're looking to kind of level set that and define that within your organization. Certainly reference the special publication 800-53. All right. So the other trend that we see that continues is that around a man-in-the-middle attack. And as probably many of you know, the Wi-Fi protocol is fundamentally flawed in that you can easily send a deauth or disassociation packet to an actual device and knock it off the network. Whether you use a Wi-Fi Pineapple, Kali, Backtrap, or one of 100 other tools, you can set up this fake AP or evil twin, maybe even increase the antenna strength to kind of attract people to either the same SSID or other things that behaviorally look the same as the actual coffee shop access point. This will allow you to not only intercept the data, but furthermore present a fake certificate, terminate that traffic, possibly decrypt it before it actually reaches the corporate network, and thus go ahead and decipher that data. So one of the things that we commonly recommend is that people use client certificates. They've been around in the SSL TLS protocol for many, many years. You push down a profile for email, Wi-Fi, other types of things like secure web access, access to SharePoint, file shares. You can push down a profile with a cert instead of a username and password to avoid brute force attacks, but in addition, do mutual authentication. So when the user goes to remotely connect to your corporate network, they're actually presenting that certificate. If a man-in-the-middle intruder is trying to perform an attack and present a fake cert, that mutual authentication fails, no data and no tunnel is set up, no data is transferred, and therefore you can avoid proactively or defensively a man-in-the-middle attack. Furthermore, on a mobile gateway or your relevant gateway, you can also do certificate pinning too. So we find a lot of companies still using VPN on mobile devices, kind of a carryover from the PC world. But if you look at this from a mobile perspective, iOS, since iOS 7, has supported something called Perapp VPN for all those native apps. So if you want to be more restrictive and say, well, gee, if I'm allowing a VPN, what if there's malware on that actual device? Is that going to come in over the VPN and infiltrate my network? Because it arguably could. So if you leverage more of a per-app VPN type of approach, you can now be more selective and say, no, I'm only going to allow these 3 apps and everything else is blocked, now and in the future, including malware. So I'd never tell you it's a silver bullet, but it's certainly a good piece of your defense in depth strategy. So let's talk about the smartwatch security research that we did. So the beginning of the week, we dropped some research we did around smartwatches. As I mentioned earlier, they included the Samsung Gear 2 Neo, the Apple Watch, the Moto 360, and a Chinese watch we bought off eBay. We wanted to really hit some of the main operating systems for smartwatches out there, and then a less common one, kind of a weird device that might also be paired with an iOS or an Android device. What we kind of determined was that Samsung has kind of moved to Tizen as their operating system. The Moto 360, of course, runs Android Wear. The Apple Watch runs Watch OS, which Watch OS 2 will be coming out apparently in the fall. And then fourthly, the Chinese watch was actually running an embedded operating system known as Nucleus. High level, and I'm going to drill into this in a lot more detail, we really identified a couple main trends. One was that when you take a look at these smartwatches and wearables, well, although they might have a PIN capability on it to protect the data on the device, keep in mind that they're proximity-based rather than time-based. We're so used in our mobile device that after 15 minutes, the PIN code that we use to lock the device kicks in. On a watch, it's more proximity-based. If it loses pairing with its mobile device over the Bluetooth, the PIN kicks in to protect the device. If you have an Apple Watch, you take it off, that also kicks in to protect the watch. Although you've probably seen videos where you can put your fingers underneath it and take it off. But that said, in addition, we found that some of the watches had no PIN or passcode capability whatsoever. So again, well, although some of these devices are designed to maybe pair with an Android device, they can also pair with iOS. The other thing is that in iOS, we determined that, well, although the Apple Watch can pair with an iPhone, in doing so, you get notifications from any app on the Apple Watch. But if you want that app behavior and data to operate on the Apple Watch itself, it must have the WatchKit extension. So although there's, 2.5 million apps in the App Store, it's probably roughly, I think, 6,000 apps that actually have the WatchKit extension. Okay? But growing, right? All right, so what did we further enumerate? Well, we found a vulnerability in the Samsung smartwatch, the Samsung Gear 2 Neo. We found a PIN bypass vulnerability. Across the smartwatches, we also found a wide variance of security features. Some had PIN and passcode capabilities, some had none at all. In addition, we found a huge lack of encryption as well. Some of the devices really rely on the app developer and their app to actually provide some level of encryption, while on the watch itself, they provide little to no encryption at all for all the data on the actual device. We also took a look at the pairing apps, which we kind of felt was an oversight in some of the other research papers we had seen. So when you acquire a smartwatch, right, typically you have to download a pairing app so you can pair it with your smartphone or your tablet in some cases. So we took a closer look and kind of reversed engineered some of the pairing apps to determine if they were kind of innocuous or if they had some risky or even malicious behaviors. Generally speaking, we found kind of the mainstream ones to be pretty innocuous. But when we took a look at the Chinese watch, we downloaded the app from a random IP address and downloaded it, reversed engineer it, took a look at it, and took a look at the static and dynamic and behavioral analysis that we did, and determined on the back end, on a back channel, it was communicating to some random IP, apparently back in China or somewhere else. Again, this is a device designed to pair with an Android device, but you can pair it with iOS as well. So let me first say Samsung was fantastic to work with. So we found this vulnerability actually way back in March and disclosed it through a responsible disclosure to only Samsung and worked with them, and they did promptly release a patch for this. But it did bring out something that was quite important in terms of analyzing a lot of these watches and determining kind of their security posture. First and foremost, Samsung kind of made a move where now their operating system is Tizen, not actually Android Wear. It looks and behaves and looks a lot like Android Wear, similar to the Android debug bridge and stuff like that. It did have a PIN It doesn't prompt the user to set that, but it does have a PIN passcode capability. In addition, when you go to pair it to your laptop, if you want to copy media back and forth, such as pictures and video and things like that, it would require that you enter your PIN before doing so. So if you're used to doing an iTunes backup to your Mac or your PC, right, it asks you to enter the PIN, does the little handshake exchange and pairing, and then you can go ahead and back it up. And we saw something kind of similar. But when we tried to connect over SDB, which is sort of, in my opinion, like their flavor of the Android debug bridge, I believe they refers to as smart debug bridge, over a USB cable, even with the PIN enabled on the device, we were actually able to access the data on the smartwatch. So that was kind of a discovery we were quite surprised about. It allowed us not only access to the media directory, but also we're able to access some of the system files and things like that. You could even read the password file too. So there's definitely some, a big vulnerability there. Samsung was great. We worked with them. They came out with a patch, so there is an update for that too. This just gives you a quick snapshot of that. So if you're used to using keys with your Samsung device in general, it supports smartwatches as well. But you can go in here and actually connect it to your PC or your Mac to kind of sync data back and forth. But when we went to actually connect over the SDB bridge, you can see here we're able to log in, first of all, with no password. So that was kind of another vulnerability we ran into. But then secondly, even though the PIN was enabled in protecting the device on the actual interface and in terms of its pairing with keys, we're able to bypass that and connect over the command line directly to the device and acquire data from it. So I'll highlight that and more tomorrow. So as I mentioned earlier, I have a demo lab tomorrow. I think it's at 4 o'clock where I wrote a tool called SWATAC written in Python that kind of demonstrates this as well as some other analysis that you can do to identify vulnerabilities in smartwatches. But also, if you're in the forensics field and you may need to now or in the future do a forensic acquisition of a smartwatch, a tool that maybe you can play around with and customize yourself. So I'll share it. It's open source, and you guys can play around with it all you want after the demo. One of the examples that it does within the code is it does the one that I mentioned earlier with the PIN bypass vulnerability so that you can actually replicate that yourself if you like. All right, so some of the additional countermeasures. We've got this continuing threat around man-in-the-middle attacks. And also, if we take a look at the retail breaches, a lot of repurposing of credentials or brute force attacks that allowed for some of the credit card breaches at some of the prominent retailers and even some of the healthcare organizations. As I mentioned earlier, quite easy in mobile to push down a certificate and use that for authentication instead, or use that in conjunction with a username and password. If you kind of model out what happened in a lot of the common retail breaches, if they repurpose the credentials, in this case a username and password, they'd still need a certificate to authenticate to a service, to an app, to email, to web access and other things over a mobile gateway into the network. In addition, if you're using certificate, in a way you're kind of eliminating a brute force attack, right? If there's no password to target, well then, you've kind of eliminated that too. Whether you have any kind of network access control or a secure mobile gateway, you can leverage something that's really important, and that's the ability to authenticate the user and the device. So, if you're managing the mobile devices within your organization, you can actually get a good idea within the console, hey, these are all the metrics and device hardware information for the devices that I'm managing within my organization, and that gets correlated either through your network access control or your secure mobile gateway to say, hey, you've got the right credentials, but A, you're either not a known device, a sanctioned device, a registered device, or B, you're out of compliance, or C, you have some kind of issues that your device looks like it's cloned or being replicated in some way or masquerading as another device. So that ability to authenticate both the user and the device, furthermore, would help you protect against some of those common retail and healthcare breaches too. In addition to all the lockdowns you can do on the device and monitoring for out of compliance, you've seen as I mentioned earlier, like FireEye, Veracode, and many of the others integrate with products like ours. And in doing so, allow you to identify malware, but also risky apps. When they're identified, you can then go ahead and leverage the quarantine capabilities to knock them off the network automatically, remove corporate data from the device, and a lot of different variances there, right? You kind of have this security knob that you can adjust from 0 to 11, right? So forgive the final Spinal Tap reference, but lots of features and options there as well to control that. We talked about all the different options in terms of OS compromise. Hey, is the device jailbroken, but are they using XCon to actually hide the fact that it's jailbroken? Has the user enabled the Android debug bridge or disabled untrusted sources? So there's a lot of different features and options there, as we mentioned earlier, that you definitely want to factor into your overall approach, security policy, and practices in terms of managing the devices. And then when the device is quarantined, number of different options from all the vendors out there that allow you to do that kind of selective or full wipe of the device if you prefer. But at the end of the day, we kind of look at it, certificate-based authentication, leveraging some kind of mobile gateway or access control in your organization, policy enforcement with the DLP controls, and then monitoring for those out-of-compliance devices, malicious and risky apps, all the OS compromise stuff, and then all kinds of alerting. So if you kind of bring this all together then, you kind of take a look at putting together some kind of countermeasures framework, really kind of want to encompass the capabilities of the user, the device, and the network. We commonly say that, hey, there's a lot of different options you have available here in kind of defining your defense in depth strategy. Some of these don't really exist in a traditional PC server world. So, for example, in terms of the device encryption or ongoing compliance monitoring and passcode protections, as we mentioned earlier, in the case of the smartwatch, you can still pair that device to a mobile device, and although that mobile device is encrypted and secured and passcode protected, that smartwatch may have all that data clear text, right? So different ways in which you could identify that and potentially block that if you like, or permit only certain apps that are using the WatchKit extension in iOS that are also enabling encryption. Also, in terms of containerization, there's lots of different types of corporate persona versus personal containerizations, things like that. Certainly, if you separate the corporate data from the personal data, you might get a lot more control over that data, especially when a threat emerges and you want to remove that data even in real time. So it certainly provides you a lot of good capabilities there. And then we're starting to see more and more file-level security. So a lot of organizations, hey, we don't want people to upload stuff to Dropbox or other types of personal cloud. Now, there are options out there where you can say, hey, I'm going to let people, download an attachment from an email, edit it, things like that, and it's fine to upload it to Dropbox. But encrypt that file at a file level and allow them to share it with other people in the organization, but outside the organization, it's just an encrypted blob that they can't do anything with it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Perapp VPNs came out in iOS 7. So you have that capability with native apps now to say, hey, I'm going to create a whitelist. It's only going to include these 3 apps and these 3 apps only, thus everything else is blocked. Kind of a nice countermeasure against malware that may be trying to infiltrate your network when the user remotely connects, or they're on your local Wi-Fi network and you're leveraging your NAC. Okay. So as I mentioned, we're going to raffle off my data hiding book, and I've got some free swag here for everybody that I'll just rip open and have everybody pass around if you would. I have an invisible line I'm not supposed to cross here, so yeah, feel free to take one and pass it on. Wanted to thank Ming for having us out and sponsoring the Packet Village and the Wall of Sheep again this year. As I mentioned, later on today, we'll be doing another presentation around covert communications related to the data hiding book. I'll talk about actually how to hide data on a smartwatch, and then Chet, one of my good friends, he'll also be going through his Python forensics code in that presentation. And then tomorrow I'll have the SWATAC demo as well. In addition, we'll go ahead and raffle off the book. But I wanted to see, a few minutes left here, about 10 minutes. Anybody have any questions they wanted to throw out there? Was that helpful? Did you guys get a few gold nuggets out of it at least? Yeah? Okay. Good deal. Cool. All right. So last call for stuff. Thanks. To keep it fair, I'll let you go ahead and choose a name out of the hat. Are you sure? Okay. Okay, I saw an invisible move towards this one, so we'll... Pierce? Cool. Enjoy. You're welcome. Well, thanks everyone for coming out. Like I said, we'll be up on the stage again doing a presentation at 4 o'clock today, and hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.